Hey everyone, welcome back to the NT podcast. I'm Nemanja Jurisic, and today's episode is going to be a deep dive into one of the most fundamental questions in philosophy, the nature of causation. More specifically, we are looking at the causal principle and a more recent and controversial view known as causal finitism. To help us unpack all of this, I'm joined by Dr. Joshua Rasmussen, professor of philosophy, whose work focuses on metaphysics, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of religion, especially questions about explanation, causation, and why anything exists at all. So, Professor Rasmussen, welcome.
Thank you. I'm very excited about our conversation. I've been looking forward to it for quite a while, and I'm excited about what we can uncover together. I think that we're going to see some special things through the light of reason and critical analysis.
Beautiful. I contacted you, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. So you told me in 2024, we can do it on 2025, but it's next year. So never mind.
Yes, there's
It's
been a
okay.
lot of life since then. Well, thank you for your patience. I really, really appreciate that. Been a long time coming.
No, thank you for coming. Anyway, I enjoy your presence. So, can you please tell us more about yourself for people that don't know you well?
Yeah, right. So I'm interested in, as you say, fundamental questions of existence. I try to get to a deep analysis as deep as I can. And I apply this in my works in philosophy, but it really is a general interest that I have in any category. So I am interested in understanding, like if I'm thinking about personal relationships, I like to understand what are the fundamental dynamics of those relationships or managing resources. What are the fundamental dynamics? I think of that as kind of more of life design or philosophy of life. But in my published work, people know me for my interest in the sort of foundations of existence, foundations of consciousness would be a more recent project I've been working on. So I teach right now at Baylor University, and I love it. It's a fantastic school with great students that like to go very deep. So it's been a lot of fun.
I didn't know about new job at Baylor. I thought you were somewhere else, huh?
Yeah, so I was at Azusa Pacific University. So this is part of the
Yeah.
reason for our delay is because we went on this quest of moving and uprooting from Southern California to Texas and taking my wife and five kids plus one on the way at the time. Now we have six kids, has been quite the adventure. So I've had to kind of slow a lot of things down and kind of regroup everything and then kind of slowly rebuild and reorient. So that's part of why I was sort of holding off on this special interview for that reason. But yeah, so that's been a fun transition from Southern California to Baylor.
So you're now with Professor Prus
Yeah,
at the
Alexander
same
Bruce,
university,
he's
right?
he's down the hall. I'll see him in the hall. It's interesting though.
Oh,
I still have. I think my best conversations with him are still through email, even though I can talk to him personally. There's something about that sort of process of thinking through words like that. But yeah, it's fantastic. Lots of great colleagues here. I mean, every single one of them is I find is like, oh wow, this is an amazing team. I do think of this team as just like the number one team in the world at what we're offering in terms of understanding reality with many different tools through epistemology, ethics. We have experts sort of on in each of the different areas, and so we all sort of kind of work well together, and I love it.
incredible. So I asked him about the interview, but he told me like, why don't you ask Josh about this? So yeah, here we are. So okay, this will be definitely a more technical episode. I prepared more than 25 questions, I think. But
Okay,
if audience stick with us, I think they will have incredibly rewarding for that. So let's get into it. My first question, Professor
we
Josh,
can call
is
this 25 steps to treasure. So we have 25 questions, and each is a step, and each treasure will be greater than the one before. So you have to stick around to the end to get the greatest treasure at the end of all 25 steps. That's my way of framing it.
that's beautiful, actually. Yeah, like a bridge. I That's like
Yes,
your book, right?
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, Professor Josh, my first question. There are various versions of the causal principle and various restrictions, but how would you define the causal principle? And please define every word, like what is the cause, what is the beginning, or existence, or anything like that. So,
Oh yeah, right, good. So just to give some context, so people are interested in why things are arranged and organized in the way they are through time. So, you know, you notice that flowers don't just like come from nothing, they seem to be located in soil. And so that suggests that there's some kind of causes that are relevant to the emergence of flowers. And philosophers are interested in this question of causation for many different reasons. In the philosophy of religion, it comes up in classical arguments for a kind of foundational cause of the rest of reality. But I mean, in just metaphysics, philosophers want to just understand the nature of causation. This is also relevant to the foundations of science. When scientists are investigating explanations, what kind of explanations are they investigating? If it's a causal explanation, what is that? What does that look like? So, I want to just kind of focus in on causal principles relevant to arguments that I've been working on that I'm interested in, which would be arguments for foundational reality. These are cosmological arguments for foundational reality. And there are different principles of causation that would identify which things are caused by which things. Right? So, flowers are caused, but what causes flowers? What I'm interested in, and other philosophers are interested in, is what is the most general principle of causation that explains the most data without counterexample, right? So, like, one idea would be, as the most general causal principle, would be that, like, everything and every group of things has some cause, right? That would cover every category, right? Like everything and every group of things in any category has some cause, some kind of prior thing that brought it about. But can you see why this general principle leads to a problem? Because if you say everything and everything has a prior cause, then that's going to imply that the total of all things has a prior cause. But there's nothing prior to the total of all things, so that leads to a kind of contradiction. There can be no prior cause of all things. And also theologically, if you think that God is a foundational reality that has no further cause, then that will also be another exception to this general principle. Now, can we restrict the principle? And there's different ways of restricting it. One principle that I like is that for any contingent things, things that exist but could fail to exist, there's some prior cause that, in a sense, explains why they exist rather than not. Take the flowers, for example. The flowers don't just have to exist, they exist under certain conditions. And so if a flower exists, we can understand why it exists rather than not in terms of those conditions. And perhaps a very general principle then that would explain all those examples of contingent things having prior conditions is just any contingent thing or contingent things has some prior cause. So that would be an example of a general causal principle. And that's very useful, right? Because now you can argue that the total of contingent things has a prior cause, not in terms of something contingent as that, because that would be circular, but in terms of something that's foundational and not contingent. Something that has a necessary existence, which in total would be foundational and the cause of all of contingent reality. That's an implication of this causal uh, principle. But even that implication aside, there's just this general quest to identify causal principles that can explain our data without exception.
Thank you so much. So I'm interested. Why don't you say, like Alex O'Connor said in one interview, that maybe Craig wants to say that everything that begins to exist ex nihilo, right, has a cause. So why
Yes.
don't you say like that? It seems like a circular in that way, right?
Yeah, so I appreciate that. So I went in for even a more general principle. So I think that things that begin to exist have a cause. But what if there's some kind of like blue marble and it's eternal, but at every moment, it's true of that blue marble that it doesn't have to exist. So its non-existence is a real possibility. Well, this leads to a kind of a question like, if that blue marble doesn't have to exist, then what sort of explains why it exists rather than just not at all? Why isn't there instead like a red marble or no marble? And so here it seems to me that there's still going to be a call for deeper explanation of this contingent thing because it's contingent, whether or not it has a beginning, right? So the age of the blue marble doesn't really explain its existence. Even if it has infinite age, it doesn't really answer why does that exist. And so that question I think calls for that further calls. And what I like about the causal principle that I offered is that it's a more general principle than that can account for more cases, but also doesn't have any sort of evident counterexamples. Now, in the Bill Craig, Alex O'Connor conversation, and I did watch that, they were talking about causes of things coming from nothing. And there's a question about like, what does it mean to begin to exist? Are you talking about beginning ex nihilo, like from no prior materials, or what about the beginning of a smile that begins to exist, but it's not from nothing. It's just a rearrangement of prior materials. And one might argue that we have experiences of beginnings of rearrangements. But what I want to point out is that we also have the experience of the lack of random objects just appearing from nothing, like blue objects just appearing just ex nihilo from nothing. We also have the experience of the lack of sort of chaos of things just coming from nothing. And so I think we can explain that experience of that lack of chaos in terms of this nice, simple general principle, which, by the way, predicts and entails more specific principles like that any blue things that are contingent have a cause, or any blue things that begin to exist, or any contingent things that begin to exist have a cause, and so on.
Yes, that makes sense to me. Thank you. So I wonder what is the history of causal principle? Who is the first guy who invented this or suggested? And also, is it true that like some people wants to say that this restriction, whatever begins to exist, at first the people wanted to say everything has a cause, and then
Yes.
they thought, oh, then God should have a cause. So let's
Yes.
say something else to, yeah, make exception. Is that a way that this started?
So, we have, I mean, as far as I know, the beginning of people having philosophical reflections includes reflections about why things exist. I mean, you have cosmological arguments in Plato, and also Aristotle and throughout the generations. But sort of for the beginning of our recorded history, we have this inquiry into causes. So we have the earliest cosmological arguments from the beginning. It's not the case that Thomas Aquinas was the one who sort of invented the cosmological argument. None of his ideas were just completely just generated originally. I mean, he has strands of his ideas going back to Aristotle, um, and there are also ideas before that. So now, as far as the strategy of coming up with the general principle and then seeing that, okay, it looks like maybe there's an exception. It's not that like, well, if I believe in God, then I'm going to arbitrarily say there's got to be an exception, right? And then, well, what about the atheist who thinks that the universe has no cause, right? And then the theist says, no, the universe has to have a cause, but God doesn't have to have a cause, right? And then the question is, well, why do I get to make an exception for God, right, and not the universe? And I think this is a very important question. I think this question points to one of the most important questions in philosophy, actually, for gaining insight into the nature of reality and how everything fits together, which is the question, what could possibly be a relevant difference between something that could exist without a cause, something uncaused, and something that depends on a further cause? If you think flowers and turtles and bananas depend on a further cause, then what about taking objects that are like flowers? Maybe they're bigger than a flower, or maybe we switch to a different fruit, like a pear or something. It seems like there are certain differences that are not relevant to explain the difference between the cause and the uncaused. And so it's a quest among philosophers is to understand what could explain why certain things are caused and other things are uncaused. And I think that quest can give you some insight. I think the principle I offered is the beginning of an answer to that. We can say, okay, certain things are contingent. Those things are caused. Flowers and bananas, they have in common being contingent. It's not just like the yellow flower and the yellow banana, they're both yellow, and that's why they have to have a cause. It's not about being yellow, right? Even if it was blue, it would have to have a cause. It's that they're contingent. That seems to be a call for explanation. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not saying contingency is the only call for an explanation. If there was like a necessarily existing turtle, you might wonder, why is there a necessarily existing turtle with that number of sides? I mean, of legs. Why a turtle and not a snake? You could still ask that question, and you might have a deeper explanation of necessities explained by other necessities, or maybe an explanation of why certain things couldn't be necessary. So we can continue to seek explanations outside of the land of contingency. So I'm not excluding other explanations or broader principles here. But just to say that I think we can make some restrictions, and that's part of the quest to sort of get clear on what causes what.
Yes, I never thought about that because maybe some necessary things have explanation or cause, but maybe there are some that doesn't. So we don't
Right.
have principle about that yet, but we
Yep.
don't exclude. So you already outlined arguments for causal principle, but can you give any structure or logical form, like why should we believe in that?
Yes, I'll do that. Absolutely. Now, are we on question? Is this question five? Are we on step five?
Oh, this is actually second question, but I had a
Oh,
lot of.
so these questions divided. Okay, so these are very, very special steps we're taking. Okay, right. So I want to make sure we get through all the questions, we get to all the treasures. And so this is a great question. So what motivates the causal principle? And as I said, there are different ones. So let me just, for sake of focus on this principle that contingent things, individuals and plurals, have some cause or condition. One motivation for this would be just experience. There's experience of things coming from other things, um, and not just individual things like a flock of birds. It's not like if you think that bird over there was caused, but if there's 10 birds, well, then the 10 birds could exist uncaused. It seems like no, there's a cause of each thing, and then there's some kind of explanation. Maybe the causes of each thing make up an explanation of the total. But the idea is that the number doesn't seem to remove the need for some deeper cause or explanation. I mean, even if you had like an infinite stack of turtles, for example, each sort of hanging on the other, the idea is that the infinite stack in the land of imagination doesn't move out of imagination into reality just on its own, uncaused. So, an infinite stack of turtles is a contingent reality. If it exists, then I think it would depend on some cause or condition, since this best explains the many cases without counterexample. I think there's also a kind of intuition of explanation that the fact that it's contingent, that means that it doesn't have to exist. And so I think the mind sort of reveals a kind of intuition that there's got to be some explanation then as to what makes the difference between its inclusion within reality versus its not inclusion within reality. So those are two general types of reasons from sort of intuition and um, from experience.
Beautiful. Okay, I will not have many side questions, so let's proceed next, like a third step. How can one challenge someone's intuition if it intellectually seems to them that perhaps things that begin to exist could also be uncaused?
Okay, right. So there's a few issues here. So one issue has to do with the strength of the principle. Are we saying that it's impossible for something that begins to exist to be uncaused? Or are we just saying that, as a matter of fact, things that begin to exist have a cause? Now, my own view is that it is impossible to begin to exist without a cause. But that is a stronger principle, and that stronger principle is not necessary to account for experiences and then to build an argument for some kind of cause of things that begin to exist, for example. Now, what about that stronger principle? Well, yeah, so there's an argument that if you can sort of conceive of something beginning to exist without a cause, that conceivability is evidence that it could begin to exist without a cause. Um, However, conceivability is tricky here because in the realm of necessities, there are all sorts of things that you might be able to conceive one way or another way, sort of loosely. Like you might be able to conceive of proving that the Goldbach's conjecture is true, but then maybe you can conceive of somebody proving that it's not true. And you don't really know each way, but both seem sort of equally conceivable. Yet, uh, if Goldbach's conjecture is true, it's sort of by the nature of the mathematical case, it's necessarily true. And if it's not true, then it's necessarily not true. That is to say, it's impossible. And so that's where conceivability can sort of break down. It's not a perfectly reliable guide to possibility here. And what I would want to offer instead is a strong principle that successfully predicts lots and lots of examples. The principle that nothing could begin without a cause predicts successfully why uh, there are all these cases of things that begin and have a cause. If instead what you say is that things could begin uncaused, then you have no guarantee that later today, all those imaginary cubes that don't exist now just flood onto your front porch and exist without a cause, if that's genuinely possible. If you say that that's not going to happen, one explanation of why it won't happen is because it can't happen. So that would give you sort of a deeper understanding of why our experiences are the way they are, in fact. Um, so that's what I would say there is conceivability is not a perfectly reliable guide, and I think it's overturned by evidence. Also, it's sort of a double-edged sword because just as you can conceive of the Goldbach conjecture being proven true and you can conceive of it being proven false, you could similarly conceive of a necessary principle of cause and effect being true. And so, does that mean that it could be true, and then by standard modal logic, it therefore must be true? In the same way that Goldbach's conjecture, if it could be proven true, then therefore, it must be true, right? Because um, of the nature of it being necessary, if true at all. So I hope that makes sense. There is a lot there.
Yes, it makes sense. And thank you again, Professor Josh. Now, are we committing a fallacy of composition when we observe things that have a beginning and are always caused, and then want to conclude that the causal principle also applies to metaphysical things that we cannot observe or study? Perhaps things that have a beginning within the universe have a cause, but the totality of physical reality itself has a beginning and yet has no cause. So, what if some strange things happen around singularities, black holes, and especially around the
Yeah.
beginning of the universe and similar events where we would expect various deviations and where even many ordinary concepts cease to apply? Some physicists claim that the very idea of coming into being or the creation of time makes no sense when we go far enough back. So, what is your thought?
Good. So three responses. First, I think intellectual humility is important here. Right? I think it's important to recognize that just because our local experiences reveal cause and effect, um, that doesn't thereby imply that things that are very far away from our local experiences are anything like what we're familiar with. I think that is a reason for humility and for curiosity and caution. So that's the first point. The second point is just I do think it is possible to extrapolate beyond local experience um, through inferences to the best explanation. I mean, it can be the case that there are planets very far away that are very different, alien from planets that we're used to, and yet we do have a theory that gravity applies over in those planets too, like massive objects. If there's an apple falls on a distant planet, gravity will apply there. So extrapolation is possible, but then this leads to my third thought here, which is that what you need to break that extrapolation, I think, is some relevant difference. So it's not enough just to point to a difference. You need to see that it's a relevant difference. So to illustrate this, you mentioned the fallacy of composition. So it seems evident to me that if one bird that exists is going to depend on a prior condition, then having a flock of many birds, the whole group of birds, is going to depend on a prior condition because the difference between one and the group doesn't seem to be a relevant difference. Now, somebody responds to me and says, okay, but that's a fallacy of composition. You're inferring that the whole has the properties of the parts. Now, I want to say, I'm actually not using the inference from parts to wholes. That's not what's guiding the inference. If I was, then that would be a fallacy of composition. What's guiding the inference is rather an irrelevant difference site. That is to say, I'm seeing the irrelevant difference between one and many with respect to the call for a deeper explanation. And so I think that would be the open challenge. If somebody says that, well, there's something very remote, like some kind of singularity, and it's so different, they I think the burden is to identify some relevant difference. Things can be very different. Like imagine an infinite stack of turtles. That infinite stack of turtles is very different from any stack of turtles I've ever seen. All right. I could tell you a story about an infinite stack of turtles. But because it's so different, that doesn't tempt me to think that I have no idea if an infinite stack of turtles will appear uncaused right before me in the next minute. In fact, I'm very confident that that won't happen because I'm very confident that no infinite stack of turtles could come to be just from nothing. But how can I say that when the infinite stack is so different from all my experiences with the finite stack? I think this is a really important point that mere difference and even huge difference is not the same as a relevant difference. And I mean, I don't want to be overconfident here, but I also don't want to be dishonestly underconfident either. I think that you can see with a certain clarity that certain differences in shape and size and number are not relevant with respect to the causal principle. And that you can then infer that the stuff at the beginning of reality um, it is not relevantly different. You can make that inference even if it's not sort of immediately clear. I was actually talking with a physicist PhD who was also getting a PhD in philosophy. This was back in graduate school, and he was kind of raising this objection here that maybe the origin of the universe is sort of relevantly different. And then I brought up the example of a chair, and I said, okay, if you're saying that this chair here needs some cause because of its nature and constitution in order to exist, it can't just exist from nothing. Then are you saying that merely changing its location in time, that you can see that a temporal difference is a relevant difference to whether the nature of the chair depends on something prior? See, maybe what's really going on is you have independent reason to think that there could not be a cause of things beginning at the first moment, right? But it's not because you see that the chair existing at the first moment is relevantly different from existing at a later moment. What's going on here, it has nothing to do with the intrinsic nature of time or chair. It has to do with extrinsic considerations that are weighing on the other side of your mind. And that's perfectly legitimate because you might have a reason to think from the intrinsic nature of chairs and contingent things and the irrelevant differences between times and spaces that any contingent things at any times and space, if they begin or if they're just contingent, they have a cause or condition. You could have that reason, and you could also have a reason to think that, and there couldn't be a cause of the beginning of things at the origin of the universe. Maybe you have some reason there. So then you have tension in your mind. And I don't think you want to reduce the tension by just kind of saying, well, no, and my reason on the one side is just gone. If you have a reason on one side and you have a reason on another side, that creates tension, which then can lead to wisdom. How do you reconcile that? Right. So my own view is that I look at those objections to thinking that a first event could have a deeper cause. Um, and and then I'm not convinced by any of those objections. So I get clarity on that side that, okay, no, there's no good reason to think that the origin of the universe couldn't be caused. I don't have any good reason. Right? Maybe somebody else has a good reason, but I don't possess that reason. So then intellectual honesty invites me then to follow my reason to think by uniformity, by irrelevant differences, that the origin of the universe, if it did begin to exist, would have a cause of its existence. And it doesn't really
Okay.
matter if it has to be a rearrangement from prior stuff, because people worry about it coming from nothing. And I mean, I think the general principle is itself evident from the more specific principles. But if somebody's worried about causation by rearrangement, then what I like to offer is sort of a modest theory. Then okay, the foundational reality is able to sort of rearrange into contingent things. So that's not an objection to a foundational reality. That's not an objection to the causal principle. That's just maybe a question about what is the nature of the foundational reality. And then I have a whole section about that. I have lots to say about that. But there's not an objection so far to the causal principle in terms of prior conditions.
Yeah, this is probably the best answer on this question. So thank you so much, Professor Josh.
Thank you.
So this was the fourth step. Now, fifth step is some philosophers suggest that there are equally intuitive principles we would accept. For example, Philippe Leon suggests that every material object that begins to exist has a material cause. Why think that
Mhm.
the cause can be immaterial, or that under whatever everything that begins to exist, we should include immaterial things as well? Wes Morrison suggests that given the number of people who find some alternative principles more intuitive, this might show that intuition is not reliable when we are talking about metaphysical matters, especially about the origin of the universe. So,
Good.
your
Yeah, I think epistemic humility is important here. Um, you know, Clarifications also help too. I mean, even that term material is ambiguous between the Aristotelian sense of a material cause, as in the stuff out of which the effect is made, like the clay that's a material cause for the statue, versus the sort of other idea of material being something like made of matter. And so then there, the immaterial cause is something like maybe an immaterial mind that's not made of matter. And so there's a principle of simplicity and modesty where we want to avoid positing more things than necessary. And this is important in my own work. So I offer this as a way of understanding the nature of reality. You want to seek a theory that explains the most with the fewest posits. In fact, that's how I arrive at my principle that contingent things, one or many, have a prior condition. I think that explains lots and lots of experience. I don't think there are any clear known counterexamples to that principle. And so then that actually has some interesting predictions, some implications, right? Now, what about the principle that whatever is contingent, it's not just that it has a cause, we're going to add that it has a cause, and here's the nature of the cause, right? Well, that's adding something that it makes the principle itself less plausible, less modest, because we're adding something to it. In fact, the principle that every contingent thing has a cause and that the cause is material entails my causal principle. So this is not an objection to my causal principle, because if this more strengthened principle is true, then my principle is also true. Um, but I wouldn't want to insist beyond experience the nature of the causes. Now, that having said that, I think one can make a case from lots and lots of examples that if we're talking about material as in the Aristotelian sense of that out of which it's made, that yeah, we can explain the construction of a house in terms of prior materials out of which the house is made. Um, However, it does seem to me that I can generate thoughts in my mind, and I wouldn't say that the thoughts are really like made out of me, right? Not strictly. So now maybe there's some kind of like stuff of consciousness that unifies all things, so you could say this is the stuff out of which all things are made. So we can keep that principle, then that all things are in some way made out of the stuff of consciousness. I think about these things, right, to sort of see how we could understand cause and effect under different systems, under different accounts. But I think what's helpful about my principle that just anything that's contingent has some cause or other is that it's modest. It sort of leaves that open. So I don't think it's an objection to my principle that there are other principles, unless those other principles really do compete with mine. Then we have to look at the principles and see, okay, are there other advantages? And that's an important project. I think research can be done on that. I think Morriston, I was his TA at one point in graduate school. And one of his shining core values is intellectual humility. He told the class, I don't really require that you believe anything that I tell you. I don't really insist on anything, except for this one thing, which is the value of, I don't know how he put it, but what I got from him was that intellectual humility, not just rushing to believe something that's true, living with uncertainty, allowing yourself to not be so dogmatic. And I think I appreciate that about him, especially because one of my quests is clarity. I want knowledge. I actually want to have the clear sight of things. And so I think humility sort of protects me from the fool's gold, the sort of false confidence. So I can keep checking it so that I can actually, if I see something, I'm actually seeing something real. So, and if I want to add one more, I know we have a lot of steps coming up, but I think this is also important, which is that I didn't used to think this, but I've come to think that it is actually possible to have a clarity about certain principles of cause and effect through irrelevant differences. I think it's actually possible to see with clarity that certain differences, like the difference between two turtles and three turtles, does not explain a difference with respect to being caused or uncaused. I think it's possible to see that really clearly, just mere quantitative differences like that don't explain or break uh, the uniformity of causation. And I think that's important. I mean, now you might think, well, maybe two turtles can be uncaused without any explanatory difference between the two and the one. But I think that the mind can sort of see that there's a problem in that leads to, and other philosophers have worked this out in detail, it leads to kind of radical skepticism where you can't even be sure that your next thoughts won't just randomly appear and your head won't randomly go out of existence inexplicably if things aren't knit together by any kind of explanatory relations. Through what I'm saying is, if there are exceptions, that there's some kind of relevant difference in the exception, right? So this is not a strong principle of sufficient reason that everything has an explanation. It's just saying that look, if there's an explanation of the existence of turtles, two turtles, then adding another turtle is not going to help us see why three turtles now would be unexplained. And so I think that's important. If you want to explain things as far as you can and you follow the principle of irrelevant differences, in my view, you can actually get clarity about that. While remaining humble and willing to be wrong, but I think it is possible to see clearly that certain differences are not relevant differences. And this is how I think you can arrive at a certain kind of confidence about certain general principles of cause and effect that then you can use to explore reality.
Fascinating. I like your way of being modest in claims, so that's amazing. So next, can you comment on the quantum eraser experiment and whether it is consistent with the causal principle? In other words, can causes, in addition to being temporally prior, also be simultaneous with their effects? A lot of people just have a deep intuitive revulsion toward timeless to temporal causation.
Oh no. Are these questions getting harder as we go? Because this is getting to be a very difficult question, right? Yeah, so there was a time where I was obsessed thinking about the quantum rate, the different experiments related to quantum mechanics, where you have the quantum eraser experiment and others related, where it does seem to sort of like mess with our understanding of causality and time, and I was trying to understand how could this possibly work? Like, what kind of reality do we live in? I mean, I should start by saying I don't know, right? This is like above, but well above my pay grade. But what I am capable of thinking about are sort of foundational constraints on sort of possible answers to the question. So as I was exploring some of these scientific studies that I was reading about and these experiments, I was thinking about playing video games where things are synchronized on your screen to kind of like make sense for the player. Um, I was thinking about those older games where you get to the edge of a screen and then maybe you like have a key and you open a door and then the screen slides and then you enter a new room, right? The idea is that that room wasn't really there until it sort of the algorithms of rendering sort of made it appear, right? So I was thinking about this in terms of the temporal order and the synchronizing of events in the world that in some of those old video games, sometimes there would be some kind of like a glitch and you have to like leave the room and come back in to kind of refresh it. So what this may sound strange, be it as it may, but like, what if this reality that we're in, the physical world, it's not really fundamental. There's actually more fundamental rules or algorithms for rendering our experiences in this world, and things need to be sort of synchronized in certain ways. And you can't really make sense of causation just from what's going on the screen or what's going on the level of what's not fundamental. Um, it's not really the case that when you put the key into the keyhole, that key is causing the door to open and then you move into the other room. Rather, there's a deeper causal connection going on in the algorithms that results in the appearance of the key, appearance of the keyhole, and then the appearance of the motion. And then it creates sort of the experience of causal order on the level of the screen, even though that's explained by a more fundamental causal order underneath. So I've wondered if maybe there's some creative ways of understanding some of these experiments, the double slit experiment, and then the quantum eraser one is more sophisticated, where it's like the reality on the screen, the sort of non-fundamental reality of experience, has to be sort of updated and synchronized according to certain rules. It's not that really time travel is possible, that the past is being affected. It's just that um, the causes are deeper in. It's like a hidden variables, like the deeper layer of reality isn't sort of manifest into this screen of experience or the material interactions. And so this is a kind of like broad constraint idea that there's some deeper causes that could explain that. Um, but as the way you might work this broad constraint into the details of those theories would require a lot of precision. And to be honest, it's been a while since I've looked at those carefully. I mean, there was a time where I was really reading the primary literature, not just like secondary YouTube videos. I was just reading line by line, turning it over in my mind, trying to get clarity, talking with my wife about it, saying, "This is really weird, Rachel. This person says this, but it doesn't really solve the problem." And so there's a lot there, I think, to explore and to investigate. But I don't see any of it sort of calling into question the general idea that contingent things depend on prior causes. It's more a question of like, how does causation work in our manifest reality?
All right, this was a hard. I think steps are even harder when you proceed. So let's go with Alex
I'm ready.
Malpass
I can
now.
handle it. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Malpass thinks that mental causation, just by its very nature, seems to take time. So it's difficult for us to make sense of a timeless mental cause. What do you think?
So there are different theories. I remember myself asking this back in high school. I had this question and I wrote some organization that's like a think tank, and I asked them this question actually. And I was thinking about God having psychological states in a timeless way. That kind of bothered me. Like if I'm praying to God and then God has no dynamic interaction with me at all, that's all just in my head. And so I wrote into this think tank, and then they gave me an email reply. I was in high school, so an email was early in those days. Also, like just came out, so it seemed kind of special to get this reply. And I remember the reply was very kind of exciting because the person was giving a model. They said there are different models of God in time. And one model is that God exists in time. And I thought this is great. So you can understand causation between mental states in time. And I thought that was a great model and very helpful. Um, so I don't think that one has to feel like in order to defend the general principle of cause and effect, there has to be timeless cause. On the other hand, I don't want to rule that out prematurely. I mean, it might just be that in our experience, we sort of experience a process of time, and maybe that's evidence then that all events take place in a process of time. But I think there is theoretical room, and there might be independent reason. I mean, there are independent arguments given for thinking that if there's a first event and that's the first moment, and then that's caused, well, the cause of the first moment is not really like it exists before time. That's a contradiction to exist before time, right? But it's like metaphysically prior to change. It's the cause of change. And you might think that conceived apart from change, you could call it timeless, just in the sense that it's not sort of intrinsically changing. But in that sort of state of what it is, it's able to cause there to be changes. A different model is that the universe is eternal and there's a foundational reality, call it God or whatever it is, that sustains the changing world forever and ever. So is always a process of time. My own view, for what it's worth, is that time had a beginning, and there's a foundational reality that sparked the first event. So that is my view. But in my arguments for a foundation, I don't require that view at all.
All right, I am glad that you didn't rule out possibility of the idea that God is maybe temporal, so that's
Yeah.
good. So, next question: does quantum mechanics undermine the causal principle, given that there are various interpretations of quantum phenomena that allow for some things, such as virtual particles, to arise uncaused?
Right. I think here we just clarify that the condition on causation does not require that it has to be a necessary deterministic link between the cause and the effect. And if somebody says, I had a conversation with a philosopher one time who said that it's kind of part of our meaning of the term cause, that there was a necessary connection here. And philosophers debate this. Hugh Meller has a book, Facts of Causation, where he articulates probability links. Michael Tooley also articulates a theory of causation in terms of probability links. But if people debate over words, then I'm happy to use a different word. It's just conditions. There's some kind of condition, whether you want to call it a cause or not. Empirically, it's not that the virtual particles appear without any condition at all. There are prior conditions, and then there's certain probabilities from those conditions of their appearance. And that helps explain the order of things. If little tiny things, I mean, just think about this. If little tiny things could just appear without any condition, then by the principle of irrelevant differences, big things could appear uh, without condition. And also, lots of small things could appear, adding up to a big thing, right? And so this breaks our causal order. So I think really the best explanation then of our causal order is that big things and small things, including virtual particles, have prior conditions if they appear.
Yeah, so that motivates us to think, because of the causal principle, to interpret quantum mechanics in other ways. So, if I understand, yeah.
Well, so just really to clarify, right? So there are different interpretations. There's the Copenhagen interpretation, the Everett interpretation, Bohm interpretation. But what I want to suggest here is that in all the interpretations, And every single interpretation recognizes prior conditions of virtual particles. And that's all we need for the principle I'm offering.
Yes, thank you. Okay, next, it's ninth question. Does mereological nihilism undermine the causal principle, given that things do not really begin to exist at all, but rather there is only rearrangements? I think you already covered this, but do you have anything to
Oh
add?
yeah, we touched on this. We touched on this, and so it's probably worth elaborating just a little bit here. So, yeah, mereological nihilism. The idea that there are only simples. That's it. There's like particles arranged in different ways, but there's not in addition to the particles like complex things. And if somebody thinks that to begin to exist requires this kind of radical coming to be without any prior stuff that gets arranged in that way, then there's the worry that we don't really have sufficient experience of things coming to be. All we really have an experience of is with things just being rearrangements of other things. And so, yeah, as I mentioned, um, I wanted to define begins to exist in a broader way. So it just includes any kind of beginning by any means. So if my smile begins to exist, then there is a smile, and I don't need to assume mereological. If I assume mereological nihilism, well, then it's hard to see how there could be a smile, right? So I'm going in the other direction. I'm saying um, we can really leave that open, So um, smiles exist, they begin to exist, and then that gives us experience. Now, here's the point that I think this gets missed in the discussions in the popular sphere. I don't recall Alex O'Connor and Bill Craig talking about this exactly. If they did, I don't remember it, which is the irrelevant difference between something that begins to exist from prior materials and then blue cubes just coming into existence right in front of us right now in our conversation without any prior materials. I think the causal principle helps explain both cases. In other words, just as it seems sort of impossible for me to begin to smile without any prior conditions, in the same way, I think it's impossible for there to be floods of cubes coming into being without any prior conditions. Or more modestly, in both cases, our experience supports the general principle. And there doesn't seem to be a relevant difference there that I can see.
Very good. Thank you, Professor Josh. Now, what if the first event is special and only it is uncaused, while all other events are caused? We would have
Yeah.
no way to know or verify that, but perhaps it makes sense for it to be special precisely because it is the first, and that is when time begins to flow. So that's the difference. Or what if there are some random events that we do not observe at all and that begin to exist without causes? Maybe there are some uncaused laws. So how would you respond?
Yeah, so there's kind of two objections there. At least in my book on the chapter called Testing Ground, this is the book How Reason Can Lead to God. I talk about both of these objections as distinct objections. I explore them quite carefully. But I think what I like about the first event objection is that it invites us to identify that relevant difference. It's playing the game that I'm offering, which is what would be a relevant difference. Now, I don't yet see why merely locating the chair to the first moment, if there is a first moment, that the chair wouldn't still be a dependent kind of thing. I don't yet see that. But now somebody might add something to the story. They might say, well, maybe if it's a first moment, then it can only be caused by something that exists before it in time. And that leads to a kind of contradiction. So now if you have an independent reason to think that the causation has to take time, and that's going to be an independent reason to think that something that exists in the first moment has to be uncaused. But now notice this goes back to what I was saying about the tension in your mind, because notice this is a reason to think that a chair at the first moment couldn't be caused because there has to be an earlier moment given this theory of causation. Um, but it doesn't remove the reason that I gave to think that the chair at the first moment would have to be caused. It doesn't remove that reason. What it does is it presents a conflicting reason. So this is where you get tension in your mind. This is really important for getting wisdom. Is they often skip this. They'll have a conflicting reason and it'll bump off the original reason, maybe because it's stronger than it, but they haven't really integrated the original reason yet. So the original reason was that there's nothing in the intrinsic nature of a chair that just by moving it from one time to another accounts for why it would thereby, by its own nature, no longer be the kind of thing that is dependent in nature. So you still have that argument from irrelevant differences in temporal position. It's just now we have this independent theory of causation. So for me, I would kind of work the other way. I have more clarity about the irrelevant difference of moving the chair at different points in time. That leads me to think the chair would have to have a cause at that first moment. I have more clarity about that than this theory of causation that the causes have to be earlier than. That's why I think, no, in my view, the foundational thing doesn't have to be earlier than the effect. It's just that it's intrinsically, apart from the effect, changeless. But there's a state that from which that state predicts the likely emergence of time or change from which time emerges. And so that makes sense to me. But also in the interest of modesty, I mean, I also have the option that that there isn't a first moment, right? I mean, that would be the other way to go if we're talking about the clarity of the causal principle, that the chair at the first moment, if there is a first moment, has a cause. And if there couldn't be a cause, well, then I'm gonna have to say, well, then whatever, then there can't be a first moment. If you think that a first moment has to have a cause and there couldn't be a cause, then that's a reason to think that there is no first moment, right? I think Michael Huemer, he has an argument like this. He thinks there couldn't be a first moment because it would have to be cause and there couldn't be a cause. Beautiful, you're following reason where it leads you. So that's what I like to say there. There's a certain theory of causation, which is not clearly true to me. But if you accept that theory of causation, then just follow it where it leads. It doesn't lead you away from the causal principle, I don't think. Now, in the interest of covering all positions here, somebody could have independent reason to think, A, causal finitism is true. There's only a finite number of causes. And related, there's only a finite number of times. B, um, causes have to be earlier than their effects. And then from there, they deduce that the first moment or whatever exists there was uncaused. Now, you could still wonder whether the thing that exists in the first moment that's uncaused began to exist in that moment, right? If you think that it began to exist in that moment versus just exists in that moment but didn't begin in that moment, if you think it began to exist, now you have independent reason to think that something can begin uncaused. But that's a lot of other pieces in your own worldview that, you know, would, and somebody could have those pieces in their mind. I'm just telling you, the pieces that I have, but also trying to help people sort of reason from their own pieces as well, because I think there's something important about the structure of the reasoning, and each person kind of reasoning from their own perspective to see more.
Amazing. What do you think about the view of Ryan Mullins as a side question? Because he wants to say that time didn't begin to exist, but there is beginningless first moment, never begin to exist. But
Mm.
yeah, there is
Yeah, yeah.
no infinite premise. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a perfect time to bring this in, right? Because here we have the idea of time not having a metric. It's just sort of this undifferentiated, beginningless thing. And I don't know. I've gone back and forth on this, to be honest. I sort of like it as a theoretical option. But yes, at the end of the day, in my view, I like the model of time that it flows out of change. And so the view that there's sort of infinite time without change, um, if that's the view now, I mean, I haven't looked at his view in a while, but if that's the view, then I mean, I think I would resist that just because I want to explain time in terms of change. So, on my view, you can't have just pure changelessness and then you can't have distinct moments of time. You can't even have endurance through time without change. Yeah.
Yes, that
But
probably
that might be wrong. I'm
depends
not
on
so committed to
definitions.
that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, no, so sorry. Can you repeat?
Oh, I was just saying, I don't have a very firm view about that. It's just some of these things, in philosophy, you're always supposed to have a view about things, and I like to tell people it actually can be helpful to have just a working hypothesis. So, my present working hypothesis, kind of like my favorite view, um, is that time depends on change, and so you're not going to have a kind of like eternal time without change. Yeah.
Yes, maybe it depends on how we define time and other things, so it's
Yes,
open for
absolutely.
discussion. Yeah.
Yes.
So next is from Mike Humor. You mentioned him already. So do you agree that scientific theories can give us an indication of whether something is metaphysically possible? For example, we know that true theories are metaphysically possible, and we don't know whether false theories are metaphysically possible. So does that then mean that even if we can imagine some things begin to exist uncaused, that this is still not strong evidence that just because we can imagine it, it follows that it is also possible.
Well, I don't know if the first parts really require the last part, even while they are connected. What I would say is that maybe I am sympathetic to the idea that the mere imagination is evidence. If I can form a mental image of a tree, that's evidence that the tree that I'm imaging in my mind is really a possible reality. It can be instantiated out there in the world. So I guess I do think that. However, I don't think, and I've thought quite a bit about this, I don't think that um, you can form a mental image of something existing uncaused. So, like, think about this carefully with me, right? So, imagine that you have a mental image of a blue dot just appearing, and you say of it that it's uncaused. Well, the uncaused part is not part of the mental imagery. Now, you might say, well, look, it was black in your mind before. That's part of the mental imagery, and it wasn't there, right? So, in your mental imagery, there was nothing there, and then it appears in the mental imagery. Right, there's nothing in the imagery that caused it. But it doesn't follow that you're imagining no cause. It doesn't follow that it's in the imagery that there's no cause. See, do you see? It's not in the imagery that there is a cause, but it doesn't follow that it's in the imagery that there's no cause. There could be a cause. In fact, when I do form that purple image in my mind, there is a deeper cause in me that causes me to generate that image in my mind, even though it's not imaged in the black. The black doesn't, so I hope you see what I'm saying here. It's the imagery, the imagination's not enough. Now, let's say we widen this, we say, oh, okay, all right. It's not strict just imagination. It's imagination plus some kind of conceiving. So we can imagine the blue ball appears uncaused, and then we attach the conception. No, sorry, we don't imagine that's uncaused. We imagine that it appears, and then we attach the conception, it's uncaused, right? Or we could say it's caused. Now, here's something really cool about this. I already talked about the conceivability problem and why it can be double-edged, and I think we have weightier evidence from experience for causation. So I'm not going to review that again. However, you might be familiar with my modal cosmological argument, where I just go ahead and just grant it. And I say, okay, you know what? If you think that something could begin uncaused, right? Then would you agree that by parity, that thing that could begin uncaused could begin with a cause? At least that type of thing, right? So maybe there's worries about origin essentialism. So that particular thing is just has its origin essentially, but at least that type of thing. And if you say yes, then I have a modal cosmological argument that goes from the possibility of certain types of beginnings to the possibility of them having causes to the possibility of a necessary foundation of those type of contingent causes. And then I use standard logic to deduce that, well, the necessary thing's either impossible or necessary. So if it's not impossible, it's necessary and therefore actual. I love that. Those arguments are very fun. You could maybe include a link or something because I have several different publications on that. And it's kind of a fun strategy. If somebody is really saying, look, I think that there could be an uncaused beginning. I've had these conversations with people. I even surveyed people too. I have data on this that many people who think that it's possible that many people who think that there could be things that begin uncaused will grant the principle that those things could have a cause. There's related principles in that vicinity, and then their beliefs will entail that there's a necessary thing. This is my necessarybeing.com website that surveys people, and finds out their answers to these questions and then deduces from their own beliefs whether there's a necessary being. So there is that pathway. I think is quite fascinating.
Okay, Professor Rasmussen, we are at the half. It's 12 question actually. Total is 24, not 25, sorry. So let's go. Is it possible for the cause of an event to itself have a cause, and perhaps that cause to also have its own causes, and so on in an infinite regress. Even if the universe has a beginning and a cause, we can still ask what caused the causing of the universe. That's something from your book. Yeah.
Good, yes. So, it's fascinating. I was seeing, you mentioned Alex O'Connor earlier, and I saw he has a very nice presentation of a kind of cosmological argument. In fact, there's this one that's very fun where he's talking with AI, and he's like convincing AI that God exists. It's like a very interesting exchange. It's just fun. And I've seen him also, Alex, present this kind of argument in another place where it's a classical kind of Thomistic type argument where even if you have a kind of infinite regress causes, there's this question about how the causal power itself sort of enters the scene. And I do like that argument, although I actually like another argument even better. Like I think that there's an even much stronger argument that just can leave open whether there's an infinite regress and whether even people talk about a vertical regress across time and then sorry, horizontal regress across time, then a vertical regress of dependence here and now. Even if the vertical regress is also infinite. See, in Alex's argument, it's like in Thomas Aquinas' argument, the vertical regress has to be has to bottom out in some kind of foundation. And William Rowe, he talks about this. He says, well, what if even that vertical regress is infinite? Well, maybe there's a third dimensional regress because you want to know, well, what explains that total vertical regress? So maybe there's a third dimension of explanations, right? And then a fourth and a fifth, all the way to infinity. There's infinitely many regresses, right? And I've thought about this and I thought, yeah, but it doesn't matter how many there are, because no matter how many there are, now we can talk about the total of whatever there is. And either the total has a deeper cause or it doesn't. Well, we already saw at the beginning of our time together that there's a contradiction if you say the total of reality. The total has a cause in terms of something that's beyond that total, that it wouldn't be real then, because the total reality includes all of reality. So then that means that the total reality is in some way like uncaused. Now that leads to a puzzle. What kind of total reality could be uncaused, right? And this is where I give my sort of argument from the puzzle of existence, how there can be a total realm, whether it's a total realm of fish or a total realm of galaxies or a total whatever it is. How can it be just in total uncaused? And that's where then I motivate the foundation theory, that it's uncaused because it has a foundational reality. And this foundational reality then helps us have that causal principle that contingent things all have a cause, one or many, in terms ultimately of that foundational reality. And so I think this is helpful when you're thinking about those infinite regresses, that that argument from contingency leaves wide open the length of the chain and also leaves wide open how many chains there are. This is left out in the Thomas Aquinas argument and Alex O'Connor's presentations, because they're trying to say, well, look, okay, maybe that infinite chain, maybe that chain can be infinite, but here's another chain that has to be finite. And I want to say, maybe let all the chains be infinite, right? Of all the dimensions. You still have a puzzle. And if you have infinitely many dimensions of infinitely many chains of contingent things, you explain the contingent things ultimately in terms of something not contingent, something that's foundational. So you can arrive at a foundational thing that's itself uncaused while leaving open the existence of infinite chains of infinitely many kinds and categories. So I think that's a very fun and interesting result. Now, there's also a question about whether I actually think the chains are infinite. So I used to think so. I mean, I used to have not only no problem with that, but I had actual arguments for why I thought that, well, every temporal moment is infinitely dividable, and so that's an infinite chain right there. But I've since rethought those arguments, and I've actually come to think that no, it's actually just potential division, and that the causes do not regress infinitely, and actually can't. I got persuaded by some of these recombination arguments. I think we're probably it's later on the list here of questions, but having to do with Grim Reapers, and there's other versions of arguments where if you have an infinite regress, then it looks like it's possible through recombination to form very strange and counterintuitive scenarios, including some that are so strange and counterintuitive they entail contradictions. So you can sort of see that they're not possible. And so I work backward. If those aren't possible, then it's because of the infinite chain that's not possible. So even though I don't require this finitism in my sort of favorite arguments for foundation, um, I also am prepared to defend causal finitism.
Awesome. I like when you add something new always in your previous answer. So, okay, next, if in addition to the causal principle, we accept that causation is event causation, Stephen Fourier argues that the combination of these two principles leads us to reject temporal finitism because every event will be caused by some event, and every event has a cause. This leads us to temporal infinitism. So, what's your thought?
Well, yeah, I mean this reminds me of my own argument, of one of them, for temporal infinitism. One of my arguments had to do with dividing temporal sections in half. Um, I actually recently put a video on my YouTube channel of a conversation with one of my daughters on maybe you've seen this on like how to move. I did talked about Zeno's paradox. Did you see this? And it's like,
Yes,
yeah, there's this sort of puzzle like how do you move without crossing an infinite number of previous points? And so she's trying to convince me that actually the points are in the mind and that they're not already just there in the reality. And actually, I've become convinced of something like that, that um, we can keep sort of dividing things, but the division isn't just already there. What's there is a reality that's potentially dividable. So I'm okay with sort of atomic motions, motions that are, um, well, I guess if they're atomic, then they're not dividable. But what I'm trying to say is that there are motions that you just make, and you could conceptually continue to divide those motions into like the first part of the motion, the next part of the motion. But prior to that conceptual division, you could call it atomic in the sense that it doesn't have parts.
okay, thank you. And as a side question, why you constantly ask your kids and wife and about all those things? Why is it important to investigate even with someone who is not professional philosopher or something like that?
Well, of course, I mean, the kids have the pure intuitions, right? They haven't been corrupted by the field of philosophy yet, so they'll say all sorts of things that like, oh, let me think more about that. I don't know if I should give this example, but I'm going to just say, like one of my kids, he asked me, this is my oldest kid when he was maybe five or so, and he was instructed to do something, and he just asked this question, like, well, why should I do what you tell me to do? And I was just like, well, yeah, the fact that he's wondering that tells me that he doesn't just see through some clear intuition that just because I'm his dad that he should obey me. And so then that caused me to really think about this more than I ever had. Like, wait, what would be a basis of parents instructing their kids? And so this actually helped me to come to a view where it's kind of a reductive analysis. So there's not just this basic authority relation between father and kids. It has to do with responsibility grounded in um, experience and other conditions of stewardship. So the why is not sort of this in principle category, which is makes life complicated because it means that in principle my son could give me instructions, if you meet certain those conditions, right? So there are different contexts there, and so yeah, my kids they have these intuitions, and it's also just purely fun because I said don't know what they're gonna say, and they say all sorts of interesting things. Now, I just want to say you included, why I asked my kids and my wife. Now, my wife's a different case because she has a kind of brilliance and an insight that tracks many categories. When I'm asking her, it's not just to find what's the original uncorrupted insight. I'm trying to understand like really what she thinks. I mean, I've had conversations with her where in the early days I had these theories um, of abstract objects existing out there in Plato's heaven, completely uncaused and there being these possible worlds. And I remember my wife, she just said, "Well, what are these things?" Like, I'm skeptical. She's like, "I don't think those things are real, in that way, in the way that you're describing, the way the philosophers are describing." I resisted that, but so I didn't believe her. But through my own track of exploration, I came to come up with my own puzzles with this sort of unrestricted Platonism, and which led me to modify my view and then come back to my wife. Say, okay, you were right, and there were so many other things that she was like, well, that seems right, Josh, but this just doesn't seem right. And then I would disagree with her until I would find my own path and realize, okay, wait, she's been independently confirmed right every single time. So that's a track record, which then has me listening to her. we took these IQ tests for fun in grad school, and I had some kind of like number, 140, 150 or something, somewhere in there. She just got all of the answers right, every single one. And so there was no, now this wasn't like a standard IQ test, but it's just one of these sort of fun ones. But we don't know her IQ because she just got them all right. So my reason for asking her is different than my reason for asking my kids. Just want to throw that in there. It's relevant to my work as a philosopher because a lot of times I get these ideas, and a lot of them do come through deep conversations with my wife. So I can't really take credit for everything that I'm sharing. She's part of me in deep and significant ways.
Beautiful. I didn't know that she's that smart. That's amazing. So, last question about causal principle. Someone said this: the causal principle does not prove that the foundation must be outside the world. Moreover, perhaps there is no ultimate foundation of reality at all. Since that is simpler, according to Occam's razor, it is better to assume that only the universe itself rather than an additional metaphysical entity, a foundation. So alternatively, perhaps the chain of causes is infinite. Each thing has a prior one, and there is no need for the first cause based on the causal principle. So these are three objections. How would you answer?
Yeah, well, I would say that it comes down to the strength of the principle. So I think, we could talk about the turtles again, right? I mean, maybe it would be simpler to say that there's no cause of turtles. Imagine a hypothetical world where all there are turtles, that's sort of a uniform reality. But if they're all contingent, then because of the principle of irrelevant differences, there's reason to think there's a deeper cause. It would be simpler that the theory on which you don't exist, right, is a simpler theory, right? However, I have reasons to think that reality is more complicated in that way. So I would argue in the same way. I have reasons to think that contingent things aren't the only kind of thing because of the uniformity of causation. Also, I've thought a bit about this in terms of surprising ways in which the sort of simplicity kind of gets relocated in different ways. So everybody has that reality in total is uncaused, otherwise you get a contradiction. So everybody has the uncaused and everybody has the caused. So everybody already has those two categories, the caused and the uncaused. And so now what I'm trying to offer is a deeper understanding of what makes sense of that division. That's not ad hoc and unnecessarily complicated. Like what I'm saying is this principle of cause and effect applied to contingent things helps us to make sense of a two-category ontology of the uncaused total and caused things. And so I think that I can do that through independent reasons that support a principle that give me simplicity in some places, even though I do grant it gives me more complexity in other places. But I think it's well-earned complexity. So that would be my general answer to all three of those questions.
Thank you so much, Josh. Now, let's proceed with causal finitism now. So, this is my favorite part of our discussion. So, what is the historical background or development of this thesis, and how would you define causal finitism, given that there are both weaker and stronger model versions? For instance, someone can say that necessarily it is true that nothing can have infinitely many causes, so there is no possible world in which something has infinitely many causes. Isn't it better to accept a modest thesis and say that it is more intuitive that the causal chain we observe in our universe do not contain infinitely many causes, rather than extending the claim to every possible world? So, any thought about it?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, to my knowledge, philosophers have always been well aware of the debates between infinitism and finitism with respect to the causal history. But as you say, there's been kind of a recent development of discussion of causal finitism. And my colleague Alexander Proust, I mean, to my knowledge, he's the one who coined that term, causal finitism. Let's just call it that. And then here's my support for that, right? And so now there's a whole bunch of sort of activity around new arguments for causal finitism. Now remind me again what the next question was, because you had the historical question, and then what was it? You just asked me some kind of objection to it.
No, no, just how would you define it? Would you go with weaker or
Right.
stronger model version? Or...
Oh, but that's right. Yeah, right. That it's more modest to say that it's contingently so. So right. So I think. yeah, let's define it as just for every causal history is finite. That's how I would define causal finitism. Um, but I mean, I do think that it's finite for reasons that are having to do with the natures of things that imply that it's either necessarily finite um, or, uh, or necessarily infinite, um, in my own view. But the view itself is more modest. So my own view is that I don't think there are like some worlds where there's an infinite history and some possible worlds where there's a finite history. I do think that finitism is either necessarily true, uh, or it's just impossible. That's my account. Um, but for modesty, I do think that it's absolutely right to just start off by defining it just as there's a finite number of causes. And we can look at arguments for that. I mean, the reason that I think it's necessarily true is that the kind of arguments for thinking that it is true are also arguments for thinking that it's necessarily true. So that's part of what's going on there.
Beautiful. So the main competitor is UPD. So what is unsatisfiable pair diagnosis, and does it offer a simple and unified solution to all Benardete paradoxes compared to causal finitism?
Right. So this is an objection to a certain type of argument from rearrangement, as I was mentioning. So one famous example is the Grim Reaper argument, where Grim Reapers are lined up to kill a particular person, call him Fred, and they're lined up to kill him at different times, but the times are arranged in such a way that there's no first time. So it could be that like one Grim Reaper is designed to target Fred at 12:30, another one at 12:15, another one at 12:07 and 30 seconds, and so on. You keep chopping the times in half and half and half so that you go through all infinite number, and there's nobody designed to kill him at just 12 o'clock, but all infinite number are designed at a time between 12 and 12:30. Um, I have a video where I give a version of this in terms of a chicken crossing the road. So it's not as like violent about Grim Reapers, just about chicken crossing the road. And there's a similar issue with infinitely many chickens with different times at which they cross, and you get basically the same paradox. So I'll stick with the Grim Reaper argument here, but I just want to say this is not about Grim Reapers, right? This is about rearranging things if you have a kind of infinite sequence. And the idea here is that it looks like each one each one is programmed to kill Fred unless Fred is already dead. And you could set it up so each one takes a certain finite amount of time to go check, is he dead? If he's already dead, then don't do anything. But if he's still alive, then do something. And it's just shorter and shorter finite times as you approach the sort of limit case of 12 o'clock. But each one has a finite time. And then you ask this question, well, who kills Fred? Well, it looks like Fred must be dead by 12:30 because each one is set to kill him if he's not already dead by the time. But then for each one, it couldn't be that one that killed him because for each one, Fred would have already been dead by the previous one. And so it looks like we have this kind of contradiction that he must be dead, but like none of them kill him. That's very perplexing. And you might want to know, like, well, what explains that impossibility there? And you might think, well, what's explaining the impossibility is that it's a contradiction. This is one way of thinking about UPD. I recently put a video on my YouTube channel where I offer a few different interpretations of the unsatisfiable paradiagnosis as a way of getting clear, like what really is the objection. And I work through each interpretation and explain why I don't think it really rolls away the deep problem here. One way of sort of illustrating what I think is sort of the deep problem is that sometimes impossibilities are next to other impossibilities. So I tell the story of an impossible soup that if you drink it, it will give you the power to produce an apple that's both green and not green at the same time, or completely green and completely red, right? Those colors occlude each other. So you can see that it's impossible for there to be this kind of apple, right? It entails a contradiction. Um, but now what about a story in which Susie has this soup and if she drinks it, she can produce this impossibility. But imagine the story where she doesn't drink the soup. Is that possible? Would it be really actually metaphysically possible for her to have this soup and to smell it. And, her husband's like, don't drink that because, if she does, then she creates an impossibility, right? But my thought is that no, this situation is actually impossible because if it were possible for there to be this soup, then it would be possible for her to drink it. And if it's possible for her to drink it, it would be possible for her to produce this contradiction. Like, what makes the contradiction impossible? People have this idea that like contradictions are the only things that like make something impossible. But if you think about like what is a contradiction? A contradiction is just a certain kind of incompatibility, A and not A. There are other incompatibilities, like being a pine cone and being a prime number. There's no contradiction in being a pine cone and being a prime number. It's not a contradiction. It's just incompatible. Now you might say, well, it entails a contradiction. Well, yeah, that's because your mind sees very clearly that you can't be both a pine cone and a prime number. So then you deduce from what you're already seeing, not through the lens of contradiction, but through the lens of seeing incompatibility. You see, okay, if it's a pine cone, then it's not a prime number. Therefore, if it's a pine cone and a prime number, it would be a contradiction. But again, it's not the side of the contradiction that lets you see that it's impossible. You already saw that it was impossible by seeing the incompatibility. So contradictions are not doing the work. This is maybe like a really important point for those who think of sort of contradictions as the gold star of impossibilities. They are a gold star of impossibilities. They're a paradigmatic case of an incompatibility. But there are other incompatibilities that you can see to be incompatible directly prior to seeing any contradiction. In fact, that's why I say you deduce the contradiction after you see the incompatibility. You can see that something can be round and red. Round and red are different, but they're not incompatible. So merely being different doesn't imply incompatibility. Round and red aren't incompatible. But red and green, those are incompatible. Being red and prime, a prime number, those are incompatible. And so I claim there are some things you can just see them to be incompatible, and some things you can see as compatible, and some you can't really see either way. So that invites humility. I think with the Grim Reaper argument, what I would say from my vantage point is I don't see just by thinking about infinity that it's impossible. I don't see that it's impossible, but I also don't see that it's possible. What I do see by thinking about the Grim Reaper case is that that's impossible. What I do see when I think about the soup case, Susie and the soup, is that it's impossible to produce the incompatible situation, but it would be possible for her to drink the soup. I think I see that possibility. And so now I deduce by reason that it's not possible for somebody to have soup, whether or not they drink it, where if they did drink it, it would produce this impossibility. And it's the same thing with the Grim Reapers. It's like if you say that, well, we're going to add a Grim Reaper at 12 o'clock, and now the contradiction goes away because the Grim Reaper at 12 o'clock kills Fred. Now we know who killed Fred. It's the one at 10 o'clock, 12 o'clock. But now you just remove the one at 12 o'clock. Now you have an impossibility. To me, that's precisely analogous to having an impossible soup and then just saying now Susie just doesn't drink the soup. Yeah, that's also impossible. So in the same way, it's impossible for there to be a Grim Reaper at 12 o'clock, even though there's no contradiction from that. Because if there could be a Grim Reaper at 12 o'clock, that Grim Reaper could be destroyed or removed from the sequence, in which case you do have a contradiction. So my thought is really the deepest explanation or the deepest reason, I'm not sure how I want to put this, the deepest sort of origin of the impossibility in the Grim Reaper scenario is anything that can recombine to form it. And I think that any infinite sequence in principle is recombinable through modal adjacent moves. You replace the thing that's not a Grim Reaper with something that's a Grim Reaper. And that should be possible because the changes are just intrinsic to the items. And so as long as you have an infinite number of items in a causal sequence, I think you can generate the impossibility, in my view. So that's why I'm not persuaded that just the fact that there's an unsatisfiable pair, that's, the only place where there's an impossibility. I think there are modal neighbors of the unsatisfiable pair, and those you can see would also have to be impossible. And when I say modal neighbors, just for the audience, what I mean is adjacent scenarios that look like they're not relevantly different with respect to possibility. It's the same thing in Susie and her soup. It's like it's not relevantly different that if she has the soup and then she drinks the soup, those seem sort of equally possible. So if drinking the soup entails an impossibility, then it's also impossible for there really to be a reality where that soup exists, whether you drink it or not.
Yes, thank you so much for detailed answer. I like that. So I watched the video. It's awesome. So yes, so what about probabilistic paradoxes? Alex Bruce wants to say that UPD doesn't help about that. So are there other paradoxes that UPD doesn't solve, but causal finitism solve?
Yeah, that's good. That's a place to explore. And I've not explored the probability ones as much as Alex, but yeah, so he does make this point. That's a nice point that UPD doesn't sort of like solve all the problems. Now, there was an APA conversation with Alex Proust, Joe Schmidt, and I on this topic, and I thought Joe raised some nice points for Alex. They went back and forth, so I think there's definitely a lot there to explore. So yeah, but it just as a general point, um, there are many different sort of paradoxes of infinity, and so if you could sort of solve all of them with one instrument, causal finitism, then that's kind of nice. If I may actually add here, there's sort of a form of argument for causal finitism that's from explaining away the paradoxes. And I think there's a place for that kind of argument. I more prefer just a sort of straight recombination argument that it's not really about explanation, although I've used that language here. It's really just that you can sort of see through modal insight that there's not a relevant difference between this clock time and that clock time and acting on its clock time versus not acting its clock time. Um, and so that this has to do with what's possible, that if one arrangement is possible, then all the others are possible. So if you find one arrangement that's not possible, then you can just deduce that none of the arrangements are possible. And I think this isn't really so much about explanation. Although you might think that the principle of rearrangement is motivated by its successful prediction of lots of cases, or maybe it best explains those cases. So maybe there is a way to bring explanation back in. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Professor Josh. Let's proceed with 17th question. So we are almost there. So is time travel possible? Does UPD allow the possibility of time travel only when it doesn't result in a paradox?
Yeah, right. That's a good question, right? Because I have structurally the same idea, which is that I don't think time travel is possible. If it were possible, then I think that it would be possible to generate these time travel contradictions. And so that's is one of my reasons for thinking that you can't go back in time. I do think it is kind of fishy to think that yeah, you could go back in time, you could have the knife to your to your mother, and you could kill her. But you just won't, because if you did, then of course you wouldn't have been born, you wouldn't exist, and therefore you would not have come into the past to even be in that moment. That creates the contradiction. So, this is why I think really if you did go back in time, you'd be going back to like a parallel universe or something, not like literally your own past. So yeah, I don't think time travel is possible in that way. Not going back in time like that.
Mhm. So would you say logical impossible or metaphysically, or how would you say?
Well, I might just say metaphysically impossible. If we define logic in a broad way, um, sort of broadly logically impossible, so that it's not just sort of strict deducibility from some canonical set of rules, but we can include reflection on all the natures of things. I would say so. Yeah, probably metaphysical impossibility. What I would say.
Yes, some philosophers don't like those distinctions. They only say it's impossible in general way, but yeah, okay. So, next question. Causal finitism quite heavily restricts the range of possible causal structures, debarring both any kind of infinite causal regress and any kind of infinite causal cooperation. Causal finitism at least puts considerable pressure on us to accept an implausible and deeply profligate, wide-ranging spatiotemporal finitism, where space and time are discrete, where the past is finite, where space is finite in extent, etc. And this introduces lots of new commitments facing lots of counter arguments. How would you answer this?
Well, I think this invites wisdom, right, to explore all of those considerations. I think some costs are weightier than others. I mean, I think simplicity can often act as a sort of a tiebreaker, for example. If I have a good reason to think that you exist over there, and you're talking to me, even though I don't really see you with my eyes directly, I just see effects of you. Somebody could say, well, yeah, but you're multiplying complexity. You're also multiplying puzzles of, it's very puzzling that other being over there. How do you understand how it could have gotten to exist itself? Um, yeah, but I mean, I think my evidence for your existence is stronger than the cost of all those puzzles. So this is sort of in the eye of the beholder in the sense that each person can think about this from their perspective. I can just say that when I've thought about the Grim Reaper argument and such recombination arguments, it just there are ways of thinking about it where it just strikes me like, yeah, that mere rearrangement. I mean, just to illustrate this, the old kind of arguments were arguments from just weirdness of infinity. So you had the Hilbert's Hotel and you fill it all the way up. Oh, the hotel's full. New guests come. And we're like, oh, we can make room. Everybody just move down a room. So everybody gets out and moves down a room, right? It's already full, but you can make more room. And somebody comes in and people say, well, that's really weird. And then William Lane Craig, he's known for saying, yeah, that's evidence that that is impossible and that infinities themselves lead to these kind of absurdities. Well, you know how people respond to that? They say they don't say what they don't say is that, well, um, you could have an infinite number of rooms and they could all be full. But the weird thing of having them all go out and then add something new. Yeah, that is too weird. So we just don't think that's possible. That's like the time travel case where you go back and you say, yeah, you can't go back in time, but you can't just kill your parents. Sort of structurally the same here as you say, yeah, you can fill the hotel. You just can't, if new guests come, you can't now actually invite them all to go out and to go down. People don't say that. And I think they don't say that because they're not seeing that there's a relevant difference there. Like, what's to block opening up all the rooms and people just, I mean, even if it's not a coordinated effort, everybody just randomly comes out of their room and goes down one, that would open up something. Instead, what people say is the common response is, yeah, it is very weird, but that's just part of the weirdness of infinity, right? Well, now when the Grim Reaper argument comes along, the weirdness gets turned more and more until all of a sudden you see it's so weird that it entails a contradiction. See, now what you could say dialectically is you could say, well, yeah, that's very weird. Contradictions are very weird. And maybe contradictions don't normally happen, but contradictions are just part of the weirdness of infinity. And so infinities do exist. They certainly are possible. It's just that contradictions can happen just only when they're infinite. People don't say that. Instead, what they say is, yeah, that's so weird. Now you've convinced us that you can't have the infinite. But what about that recombination? I mean, why not retain the original instinct that people had with respect to Hilbert's Hotel, which was that recombination principle, that was true. That is to say, you can recombine the people to open up rooms. And so if Hilbert's Hotel is impossible, but we're not granting that, then these other infinities are impossible. Well, now we say that with the Grim Reaper. Now we are granting that the Grim Reaper scenario is impossible because it's so weird that it's a contradiction. That is impossible. And we still have the recombination that led us there. Recombination implies then all those adjacent scenarios are also impossible. And I think that's kind of my intellectual story. I mean, that's kind of how I got persuaded by it. I wasn't initially persuaded. I remember seeing it on a blog by Alex Proust. He was tinkering with arguments. He had some argument for finitism first from widgets and stuff, and then he had an argument against that argument for infinitism and then an argument against infinitism. So he was kind of going back and forth, just exploring the realm of ideas. And then I was just like, oh wait, what is this? You just got to a contradiction from rearrangement. That's how I think of it. It's just like there's plausible rearrangements, plausibly possible rearrangements that will give you the scenario that's impossible. And it's not impossible because it's contradictory. What it is that you can see that it's impossible. And because contradiction is sort of a paradigm case where the sight of impossibility is so clear, psychologically that convinced the philosophers that, oh yeah, that scenario is impossible. And they didn't say, well, it's just part of the weirdness of infinity to have contradictions that are still possible. That's not what they said. They said, yeah, the difference between finite and infinite is not relevant to whether contradictions imply impossibility. So that's impossible. So I'm saying a lot here just because I think there's subtleties here. It takes a little bit of work, taking a little bit of work for me. And I don't want to be overconfident about this. I mean, yeah, I could be wrong. Um, but it sort of surprised me is what I want to say on my own journey. I myself thought infinities are not only possible, but they're actual, but they're just weird in certain ways. But then once weirdness sort of got cranked up to a certain level, I retained those recombination instincts, I guess. But let me just say there are different candidate recombination principles, and some of them are more plausible than others. And there is real work to be done in clarifying a recombination principle that's immune to its own counterexamples that is a good solid principle, because there are other cases where recombination doesn't hold. And so this is an area of wide research.
Amazing. Thank you, Professor Josh. Now, just to clarify about time, does it need to be discrete? Because if I remember correctly, Professor Bruce wants to say in his book that causal finitism is maybe compatible with time being continuous, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. You could have continuous time. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up here. It has to do with causes, right? So you could have continuous time and still a finite number of causes. Um, I think for my part, I'm not sure if that's really even a relevant difference. Like it does seem to me that if you could have um, infinitely dense time, that like why couldn't you then have just infinitely many causes, just shorter and shorter and shorter? Um, so I think that I will go ahead and grant the plausibility of the dramatic implication that if causal finitism is necessary, then it's also necessary that time is not infinitely divided. It may be infinitely divisible. I do think that, but not actually infinitely divided. So I do see that, yes, technically, you can be a causal finitist and think that time is continuous. I do think that's an option. I'm just saying my own view is that I sort of see those as going more closely together.
Yes. Does it same works for space or?
I, yeah, this is good, and it deserves continuing thought on my part. My instinct is to say yes. There's something about these things that all sort of seem structurally on par. Maybe what I would say more general as sort of a strategy is that if you're going to make a distinction, then you owe sort of an account of the relevant difference between space and time, or between time and causal sequences. And maybe then you can give that relevant account. But otherwise, I do sort of see it sort of intimate connection between these. So if you're going to be a finitist along one dimension, it is very tempting to be a finitist along the others. This isn't to say that you have to be a finitist along every dimension. Like you could be an infinitist with respect to abstract objects, for example, but still be a finitist with respect to the sort of causal sequences and sort of adjacent um, concrete items.
All right, thank you, Professor Josh. And this is a really hard question for me, so can you please explain? Causal finitism does not offer a unifying solution, which was supposed to be its most attractive feature. There are
Oh, right.
non-causal Benardete paradoxes that causal finitism simply cannot solve. Given that these are exactly parallel paradoxes to causal variants, I take this to be the serious cost of causal finitism. The paradoxes should clearly have the same solution. So here is a quote from George Schmidt. He says, instead of supposing that the reapers in question are causally sensitive to what the previous reapers do, we can instead suppose that it is simply a brute fact about them. In the story, it is just a brute fact that they satisfy a conditional like, I kill Fred if and only if none of the previous reapers kill Fred. It's not as if they check what the previous reapers do. They just satisfy that condition in a brute way. Or maybe they are somehow non-causally explained by what the previous reapers do, rather than it being a brute fact. Of course, you might say there cannot be that kind of non-causal dependence, or there cannot be brute facts. You can say that, but notice that we no longer have a unified solution. You now just introduced inelegant conjuncts into your theory. It's like, okay, causal finitism handles all these cases, but now we also have to bring in some other substantive metaphysical thesis to deal with these other paradoxes that are basically identical to the original ones. What are you doing? I think you're making the wrong approach here. I'm not attracted to this argument for causal finitism. End of quote.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point. I mean, and this is part of even my own reservation about a purely explanation-based argument. I mean, I think it can be developed in certain ways where you motivate the restrictions and you recognize that it explains a lot of cases, but doesn't explain all the cases. And so, maybe there's multiple different types of explanations at work. Um, I've had this thought, and this is really on the edge of my mind, that there's some deep problem with a certain type of self-reference, kind of like sort of rigid referring to itself, and that actually part of the problem with the causal infinity is that you can then generate these self-reference. You actually end up setting up self-reference problems from the infinite. So there's a bridge from infinite sequence to self-reference problem. But the self-reference problem, you can get to there without the infinite. So there's like many different bridges to the self-reference problem, and the self-reference problem then leads to all sorts of other problems. But I mean that's probably not the best idea here also because what I mean here is that there are other um, problems with infinity that don't go through self-reference. And so, I'm thinking about Alex's probability arguments, and it's not sort of explicit that the Grim Reaper argument goes through self-reference, but I mean, there is that conditional, like if and only if it was already done, and um, there's ways of linking that to a self-reference problem, like with the liar, where it says, this is true if and only if this other statement's not true, and the other statement says that of the other statements, you get kind of self-reference or no grounding of it. But all that to say, because those are thoughts on the edge of my mind, there's a lot here to explore in terms of principles that unify and explain the roots of problems, right? And so I recommend that exploration. But like I said earlier, this is one, I mean, Joe makes excellent points there. I mean, one of my own reasons for kind of not preferring the argument from explanation, but more preferring a kind of argument from recombination, just is that the argument from explanation leads into all these sort of competing explanations and doesn't explain everything. And so that seems messier to my mind. I know Alex has things to say about that. It's less clear to my mind. And I haven't explored that as deeply. So it seems like what seems clear to my mind is just principles of recombination. Like if you could drink the soup there, then it shouldn't be an impossible soup, and so on. So let me add a note here. I mean, Joe also raised to me an example where you have two statements that are different just by some kind of quantity, and yet it's clear that the one is possibly true and the other is not possibly true. There are many examples we could give of this. And this shows a kind of modal continuity where you have two statements that are just kind of adjacent to each other. And you say, well, they're both possible or they're both impossible. That general principle has exceptions to it. And so that's why um, coming up with a modal recombination principle that's sort of specific enough to avoid counterexamples uh, and general enough to make the relevant predictions is a kind of project. But I mean, and that's a project that I've engaged in, and there are different candidate principles. But um, I think I mentioned one in my video. There are others. I keep thinking about this. I think there's probably an abundance of riches here, sort of many different recombination principles that kind of capture this sort of intuition that like with Hilbert's Hotel, like, yeah, if you could fill a hotel, then you could have them move down one. If you could have the infinite sequence of Grim Reapers, including the one at 12 o'clock, then you could remove the one at 12 o'clock, resulting in in the contradiction, etc. So I think Joe makes a really excellent point. And again, just to summarize, that's a reason why I actually shy away from the argument from explanation and more towards the argument from recombination.
Mhm. Sorry if I missed something, but I didn't understand really. Can you help me again? Because we have a whole book about Benardete paradoxes, and we have solution for all of them with UPD. But if we use the causal principle, we solve only causation paradoxes, right? We still have unsolved paradoxes about non-causal paradoxes about yeah B arguments. So if we want to say that causal finitism is true, we need to let's say, pay another thesis so we can solve other paradoxes that we didn't solve with causal finitism. Can you help me with that?
Well, that's I was thinking of that as part of the argument from explanation, that you're trying to offer this as a sort of explanation that solves the paradox. Um, I mean, I'm not really even seeing the UPD as like so. Maybe the way that I would put it is that UPD sort of identifies a certain kind of constraint. Um, that certain kinds of things are contradictory, and so your theories just have to move within that constraint. So I'm not thinking of sort of finitism as competing with UPD as an alternative explanation. I just accept UPD, right? And then I'm adding something. I'm saying, and there's independent motivation for certain recombination principles that motivate causal finitism.
Okay, so I understand now. You can accept both theses, right?
Yes.
Amazing. So can I share a screen? I have a longer question, so it is easier to see maybe. This is from Joe Schmidt. He says that model epistemology supports deflationary solutions. So here are three worlds, and we can imagine some things, and it seems to him that those are at least possible. But if you want to say causal finitism is true, then we should say that all three worlds are impossible. So do you have any answer on this?
Well, I would want to sort of read these carefully here. So let's read them together with the audience. So W1 is a spatially finite Newtonian world, and there is an infinite series of massive particles, each of which has half the mass of the previous one and is located at half the spatial distance. Okay, great. Each such object exerts some gravitational influence on the others, and thus infinitely many entities causally impinge on a single entity. Okay, I see that. So there's an infinitely many entities work together to have an effect, right? All right, W2 contains an infinite past in which two simple particles orbit each other forever. This appears to involve an infinite causal chain. All right, good. W3 is very similar to the actual world. By stipulation, it has continuous time and 1 second process of me dropping a pencil. Okay, right. So this is an infinite through continuous time. Furthermore, suppose that each instantaneous state of that process is causally related to the substance. So now we have causal infinitism. Okay, great. Beautiful. So these are three different scenarios and we can like conceive of them. So conceivability, each of these seems perfectly, beautifully conceivable. Um, in some sense, right? So it's not that I'm actually like in my mind forming a mental image of each and every item, right? So this is like when we talked about imagining something existing uncaused. It wasn't that it's part of the image for it to be uncaused. It's just there's this conceptual added piece that says, and it's not caused, right? So similarly, it's not that I'm actually conceiving of each and everything all the way to infinity. It's that we add this conceptual piece and there's there's no number of them. Okay? There are them, but there's infinite. Well, what does infinite mean? It just means for every one there's another one, right? So we're adding that conceptual piece, right? So now that's the kind of conceivability. It's at that level, right? So now modal intuition, each seems to me completely innocuous. I thought Joe was going to say possible, to which I was saying, all right, fair enough. I respect that. Does it really actually seem possible? But he used the word innocuous, right? So um, that feels a little bit like easier for my mind. It sort of seems innocent. That is to say, to me, this is another way of saying I don't see an impossibility in there, but that's different than seeing the possibility. Okay, I just didn't finish reading the sentence. Completely innocuous, completely possible. All right, so see, so he's saying that's how it seems to him, and I respect that. So modal uniformity. These worlds, or at least um, worlds relatively similar to them, differ from the actual world only in purely quantitative respects. Fair enough, right? So now he's going to make the argument from modal uniformity, but so where I myself find myself in a different point in the epistemic landscape is I don't have that same sort of striking seeming of possibility of those worlds. I don't have that. And I'm bracketing my independent argument or my independent reasons for thinking that finitism is true, which should be an independent reason to think those worlds are not true. I'm bracketing that. I'm just looking to see, does conceivability give me sort of insight into the possibility? I think for me, it's a bit like the case of the uncaused blue dot. It's that it's not part of my own positive conception to include the things, the all the infinite things. So I have to add this concept that they're all there and there's no limit. And that concept for me is very fuzzy. It's not a clearly coherent concept to me. I've been kind of working on that actually. Like what is that infinite? It's like, and one more, and one more. Like, what is that? It's very hard to like pin that down in my own mind. So doesn't sort of clearly seem possible. And again, conceivability is sort of two-edged here because one could argue that the Grim Reaper scenario, it's impossible. There's a conceivable chain from the steps in the Grim Reaper argument leading to that impossibility. And then that means that impossibility is possible, given that conceivability implies there's evidence for possibility. But then, given the standard logic, it can't be possibly impossible unless it is impossible. So, anyway, there's a sophisticated lines where you could make an argument that conceivability is two-edged. I'd have to explore those more. But I think my more substantial point is that I want to sort of respect the intuition if you just look at those cases and you find them possible. But I think my initial point there, my kind of like um, pointing to the word innocuous, I think actually points to an important lesson. Like whatever your intuition is, there is a lesson about the difference between actually seeing into the possibility of something, seeing it, and maybe seeing it clearly to some degree, versus what you're not seeing is the threats to the possibility. You're not seeing the impossibility. And so it's very easy to confuse not seeing the impossibility for seeing the possibility. Those epistemic states are so similar that it takes a bit of concentration to tease them out. I'm not saying that Joe is sort of conflating those. He's not. He's paying attention in his mind and he's finding himself with the intuition of possibility. And I respect that. But that would be the place to sort of introspect it, especially with that word innocuous. Is it really that you see into the possibility, or is it that it's innocuous? You're not seeing the threats to possibility. You're not seeing its impossibility. And I think that would be sort of a place to inspect further. But again, I mean, this all has to do with how plausible the arguments seem to you. I mean, if you find a recombination principle quite evident, then that could itself just be a reason to think that causal finitism is true. And you might think that's also evident that those scenarios are possible. And then by modal continuity, adjacent to ours in a way that implies that our world is infinite in the past or has an infinite causal chain. And that just means that you have reasons on both sides of your mind to weigh. And I always like to say and point out, I think it's a sign of a mature mind that you can recognize reasons on both sides. Even if in this moment I'm not quite recognizing in myself that I have an intuition of possibility. But in principle, I think I can respect that intuitions can sort of vary on these matters. These are not sort of easy matters to think about, which isn't to say that we can't make progress in making them clearer through time. I think we have already. So those are my thoughts about this very advanced. I would call this a very advanced objection, fun objection.
Okay, thank you so much for reading because my English is not so good. So we need to finish soon, but we have a few questions. Can we finish just, I
Let's
think,
do it.
three more? So thank you.
Okay.
And Michael Humer suggests that his theory is better, where we simply and independently conclude that infinity is not a number. And from that, we derive that there cannot be infinite intensive magnitudes. This, according
Yeah.
to him, resolves many, though not all, of the paradoxes that Alexander Proust discusses in his book, while the other paradoxes, according to Humer, will have to do with infinity not being a number, for example, puzzles about the arithmetic of infinity. Therefore, is this a better solution than causal finitism?
Well, again, if you think of causal finitism as a kind of solution, an argument that sort of explains why this scenario is impossible, then you're going to end up with this kind of competition with Hume's solution. But I don't think of it like this. The way that I think about it is that there are two independent reasons that can go together and they're mutually reinforcing. So I actually quite like Hume's thought that infinite intensities aren't real, that there's no such thing. I quite like that. I think that's true. And that being true does not undercut the recombination principle, just like UPD doesn't undercut the recombination principle. In fact, this is part of why I find it hard to even conceive of those scenarios that we just looked at the previous screen, is because they all imply an infinite number. It's not an infinitesity in terms of a degree, but it's infinite quantity. And that I find to be something hard to really conceive. And I think that there are independent reasons to think that there's just no such thing as that.
Very good response. So here is the last longer question. So I need to read everything. So, quote, other causation-like dependence relations can have infinitely many basing entities, which gives us reason to think causal dependence can likewise have infinitely many basic entities. These alternative relations are things like grounding, ontological dependence, and more generally, any kind of explanatory dependence relation or dependence relation which backs explanation. These relations are causation-like in that they plausibly share the same formal properties as causation, like asymmetry, irreflexivity, transitivity. They are explanatory or back explanation, and they, in some sense, bring something about or generate something. Also, intuitively, there seems to be no relevant difference between causal dependence and non-causal dependence relations, which could explain why it is impossible for the former, but not the later, to have infinitely many basing entities. Moreover, whatever makes infinite causal dependence impossible would plausibly be shared by infinite non-causal dependence too. So causes of infinite basing for causation-like dependence relations. For example, God knows that he knows all truths, given the transitivity of dependence and the fact that a subject's knowing that P partly depends on the fact that P, we have a dependence on infinitely many things. Second example is God is omnirational, and so if he chooses to actualize some world, he does so on the basis of all the reasons favoring the actualization of the world, since there are infinitely many reasons favoring the actualization of the actual world, and since those reasons partly explain his awareness of them, or partially explain his choice of world. We have dependence on infinitely many things. Third example, the set of natural numbers depends on infinitely many things. And last, if space and time is continuous or dense, and if temporal intervals or spatial regions depend on their constituent instants or points, then one thing depends on infinitely many things. So sorry about this, but can you get
Yeah,
us
very
going?
good. And I can address this pretty briefly, I think. So the idea here is that if causal finitism is true, then by structural similarity, we should expect dependence finitism to be true. That is to say that any chain of dependence will bottom out in some sort of ultimate thing. But we have examples of infinite dependence chains, such as like the numbers and knowledge in God's mind and so on. So it's kind of like, we could argue the other way. There are infinite dependence chains, if they're infinite dependence chains, then for structurally similar reasons, causal finitism is not true. So I appreciate that argument, and I actually sort of follow it to the results. I'm actually quite sympathetic with just saying, yeah, the chains are finite, whether dependence or causal chains. Now, let me be clear. My favorite arguments for fundamental reality, as I mentioned, the ones I get so excited about, don't depend on any kind of finitism at all. But I'm just telling you about sort of my honest updates in my worldview that I also independently um, accept a kind of causal independence finitism. So then I have to say something about each of the examples. Christopher Menzel, he's got a nice piece about sets and numbers where there's an argument there that these are contingent things. So there's a kind of potential infinite. They're not just already there in an infinite chain of dependencies. And I have myself independent reason to think that there has to be something like this true, that there has to be some kind of contingency in the development of those things, because otherwise you get some paradoxes that can be sheltered through certain moves that ultimately I don't see how to shelter them ultimately. So not to go into those here. Um, my own view would be to just accept the implication here. And I think this is really an important result. I mean, this is about the nature of reality, that there's a kind of finitism in the structures of causal independent structures that would sort of follow. But if you have reason to think that there's infinite structures, then the next thing is to consider, are those relevantly different infinite structures from the causal structures? And if you don't think they are, then that's going to be a reason to think that the causal structures can also be infinite.
Thank you, Professor Josh. And just a question, do we have implications for God if we accept causal finitism? Because I read recently a paper from Henrik Gell last year. So he recently had an interview on the channel of Pat Flynn, and he said if you want to be a theist, you should reject causal finitism because it has implications on God's nature, like necessity or rationality or omnipotence. So.
Well, it does have those implications, but I don't think the implications need to imply uh, probably what he's thinking that they imply. This has to do with other theories. So, well, let me just make a note here. We've made it through all these steps, and we've reached this great treasure. And the great treasure now at the very end of our journey together is atheism, because causal finitism is true, but if God exists, right, then causal finitism can't be true. Therefore, God doesn't exist. I mean, this would be quite fascinating. It'd be kind of fun, like make a video where you have this new argument for atheism from causal finitism, when the theists are using causal finitism to plug into their favorite arguments for theism. Like the Kalam argument uses causal finitism. So you just take causal finitism, turn into an argument for atheism. I think that's a lot of fun. But that's not my goal here. So I actually have been thinking quite a bit about a kind of iterative model of reality, where the foundation of reality is pure and complete and perfect, and will count as God according to classical accounts of God. It will have a kind of unbounded awareness and power. But this is a kind of qualitative unboundedness. It's not an infinite quantity. And there's a kind of iteration to creation where I have a whole theory now, even of numbers getting created through abstraction, and that these things happen over time. And they're grounded in prior essences. So it's not just this kind of unwieldy, like you could just make contradictions. There's constraints that flow ultimately from fundamental reality. So, no, I mean, I would say I don't see clearly at all that there's any problem with being a causal finitist or a dependent finitist if you're a theist. Even though I do say, yes, it does have implications for your theory of the nature of God. But I do not think at all that it implies atheism, in my view.
Amazing. And last, would you mind if I ask you just about future because it should be also finite? Can you comment that briefly?
Right. So I have a similar thought about the future, that there's a kind of iterative progression. So there are statements like there will be no final day. There's no day that, we can't say that there's going to be some sort of final moment and then there's just nothing after that. Um, but it doesn't follow that, like right now, the infinite, like in some sort of abstract realm, there's an infinite number of days that just exist. So, just like what I would say with the numbers, you can keep approaching more and more numbers, and there are rules of approach, but they don't thereby already exist on this account. Um, so if you want to take the causal finitism and you want to use this as a device to get to finitism in these other domains, I mean there are ways of blocking that pathway from causal finitism to finitism in these other domains, but I'm sort of happy to take the paths to those other finitisms, and so that's what I'm going to say about the future, is that there's a continuation, but it's not true that there's some infinite number of events that are already sort of in existence that correspond to future days. And this fits well in a way with a dynamic theory of time. So um, now, unlike my colleague Alex Proust, who favors a B theory of time, in a kind of eternalist model of time, my view is that there's a kind of growing nature to things. And so I'm not saying the growing block theory per se. What I'm saying is that there's a kind of dynamic nature to things, and the future is not yet, and it's not all just there. So, what would Alex say about these things? Well, I mean, he has engaged in some of these questions. And so there he tries to motivate some distinctions where you can have infinities along some lines and not others. And it takes sort of careful work to think through those distinctions. I think there's room here to explore and research further.
Amazing. So we did it. Thank you, Professor Josh. And any conclusion, last word, what people can read about this topic if they are interested? And yeah,
I think reading work by any work by Joe Schmidt is always going to be a treasure for your mind and heart. Alex Proust has worked on this. Robert Koons has worked on this. And I would just say, thank you for this time. I feel like just talking about these things is so much fun. And I feel like there is something kind of cool about going step by step, question after question, sort of see what we can see. And I hope that this is fun and entertaining, and also to some degree empowering. I think it's important for people to tap into their own powers, to see things, to see what they can see by their own lights. And if you can sort of see this exploration at the edges of reality and see that distinctions can be made, even while you're not seeing everything, can you see some things? And I think that kind of progress of seeing some things is very important. And everybody has that power to see some things and to see more than they had. And so I hope this serves everybody on their journey. And thank you for having me with you.
all right, that's a wrap for today's episode. We covered a lot of ground from causal principle to causal finitism. Huge thanks to our Dr. Joshua Rasmussen for joining us and helping us navigate these deep and challenging issues. And dear audience, if you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to subscribe, share it with someone who is into philosophy, and let me know what you think in the comments. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.